In 1849, beneath the ruins of ancient Nineveh, archaeologists unearthed a collection of clay tablets that had lain buried for over 2,000 years. Most contained administrative records, trade agreements, the mundane business of civilization. But among them was something else, a series of fragments that spoke of humanity's creation and of the divine judgment that nearly ended it. These tablets describe 5 distinct bloodlines, each marked by the Anunnaki, the gods who came from the heavens for extinction. Yet somehow, against the explicit will of the gods themselves, one bloodline survived. Tonight, we trace the origins of that survival and ask why we are still here to wonder about it. To understand what those ancient tablets truly reveal, we must first travel back, not merely in time, but in understanding back to a world so distant from our own that even its landscape would seem alien to modern eyes. A world where 2 great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, wound their slow and silted paths through a flat and fertile plain that stretched beneath skies of hammered bronze, where the heat shimmered and rose from the earth in waves, and where sometime around 5,000 years ago, a civilization emerged that would change everything we know about human history and human potential. This was Sumer, the land between the rivers, the place the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, and it appeared in the archaeological record with a suddenness that has puzzled scholars for more than a century, because before Sumer there were scattered villages and simple farming communities. And then, quite suddenly, there was everything. There were cities with populations in the tens of thousands. There were temples rising in step towers toward the heavens. There was mathematics and astronomy and complex systems of law and governance. There was art of extraordinary sophistication. And there was something else, something that had never existed before. Anywhere on Earth there was writing. The emergence of Sumerian civilization presents what academics have long called the Sumerian problem, because these people seem to have arrived fully formed with their language, unrelated to any other known tongue, with their technologies and social structures far in advance of anything that preceded them, and with their own origin, stories that spoke not of gradual development, but of gifts given suddenly and completely by beings who descended from the sky. Picture, if you will, the landscape of ancient Sumer not as a desert, but as a garden, a place of irrigation, canals and date palm groves, where barley grew in abundance and where sheep grazed on the margins of cultivated land. A place where cities rose from the flat alluvial plain like islands of human ambition, surrounded by the eternal patience of agriculture. And above these cities, rising higher than anything else, the ziggurats, those massive stepped structures that served as bridges between earth and heaven, between the realm of mortals and the dwelling places of the gods. The people who built these monuments and tended these fields and administered these cities possessed something that no human community had ever possessed. Before, they possessed the ability to make their thoughts permanent, to press meaning into clay and have that meaning survive beyond the span of a single life, beyond the span of a generation, beyond the span of a dynasty, to reach across thousands of years and speak directly to us tonight. Writing emerged in Sumer around 3400 BCE, and its development from simple pictographs representing concrete objects to the abstract wedge-shaped marks we call cuneiform represents one of the most profound transformations in human cognitive history. Because when writing came into being, something new entered the world, a form of memory that did not depend on living minds, a way of storing knowledge outside the fragile vessel of human flesh, a kind of immortality for ideas. The scribes who mastered this sacred art were not mere clerks or bureaucrats, though they did keep the records of temple offerings and royal granaries and commercial transactions. They were the custodians of divine knowledge, the keepers of the secrets that the gods had entrusted to humanity, and they understood the weight of their responsibility in ways that we who live surrounded by written words can scarcely imagine. Imagine a young scribe in the city of Nippur sitting cross-legged in the courtyard of the temple school, his lap holding a tablet of wet clay, soft and cool against his palms, his right hand gripping the reed stylus cut at precise angles to create the distinctive wedge impressions. And as he presses that stylus into the clay, he is not merely recording information. He is participating in a sacred act that connects him to the gods who first taught this art to humanity. He is adding his small voice to a chorus of preserved knowledge that will echo through ages he cannot foresee. The clay tablets of Sumer were not intended to last forever. They were made for immediate use for the business of the day, for the records that needed to be kept, and then stored away in archives where they sat in their thousands waiting in the darkness. And then catastrophe struck, as it so often did. In the ancient world, cities burned, conquering armies put torch to temple and palace. And something miraculous happened in the destruction. The very fires that consumed the cities baked the clay tablets hard as pottery, preserving them for millennia, while everything else crumbled to dust. We might never have known what these tablets contained. We might never have recovered the lost world of Sumer, if not for the curiosity and determination of 19th century archaeologists and adventurers who traveled to the Ottoman territories of what is now Iraq and began to dig into the great mounds called tells that dotted the landscape, mounds that the local people had long known contained the ruins of ancient places, but whose true age and significance remained unknown. In 1849, a British archaeologist named Austin Henry Layard was excavating at a site called Kuyunjik, across the river from the modern city of Mosul, when he uncovered something extraordinary, the remains of a vast palace belonging to the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, who had ruled in the 7th century BCE. And within this palace was a library, a collection of clay tablets numbering in the tens of thousands that Ashurbanipal had gathered from across his empire, including copies of texts far older than his own time texts that reached back to the dawn of Sumerian civilization. Picture the scene in the British Museum in the years that followed, as scholars labored over these tablets, working to decipher the strange wedge-shaped script that no living person could read, piecing together the grammar and vocabulary of languages that had been dead for 2,000 years. And then, gradually, inevitably, the words began to speak, and what they said shook the foundations of Victorian certainty. Because here in these tablets were stories that every Sunday school child knew, but older by 1,000 years than the Hebrew scriptures' stories of creation and flood of gardens and serpents of towers reaching toward heaven. The tablets spoke of the Anunnaki, the great gods of the Sumerian pantheon, and this name itself carries meaning that scholars have long debated, because in one reading it simply means those of princely seed or those of noble lineage. But in another reading, one that has captured the imagination of generations, it means something quite different. It means those who from heaven to earth came, and whatever the precise translation. Something remarkable emerges from the texts. These were not abstract deities dwelling in some metaphysical realm. These were beings who, according to the tablets themselves, descended to earth, who walked among humanity, who built structures and established cities, who took mortal consorts, and who ultimately sat in judgment over the very creatures they had helped to create. The Anunnaki occupied the highest tier of the Sumerian divine hierarchy. Beneath them served the Igigi, the lesser gods who originally performed the labor that kept the cosmic machinery running, who dug the canals and tended the fields of heaven until their burden became too great, and they rose in rebellion. And it was this rebellion, according to the ancient texts, that led directly to the creation of humanity. For when the Igigi refused to work any longer, the great gods devised a solution. They would create a new being to bear the burden of labor, a being mixed from the clay of the earth and the blood of a sacrificed god, a being that was neither fully mortal nor fully divine, but something in between, a hybrid creature designed for servitude, but containing within its very essence a spark of the sacred. The tablets describe how the goddess Nintu, also called Mami, the mother goddess, mixed clay with the blood of a slain god named Geshtui, whose name means ear or understanding, and from this mixture fashioned the first human beings who opened their eyes in a world they had not chosen to enter. Bound to labor they had not agreed to perform, carrying within them a divine inheritance they did not fully understand. This was not creation, as later religions would imagine it, not a loving father breathing life into a cherished child, but something more complex and more troubling. The making of servants, the engineering of workers, the design of beings who would do what the lesser gods refused to do, while the great gods looked on from their celestial heights, accepting the offerings of sacrifice and the smoke of burnt grain as their rightful due. And yet, the relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity was never simple, never merely that of master and slave, because the tablets also record moments of divine affection, divine protection, divine advocacy for the human creatures who toiled below, and chief among those divine advocates was Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water who dwelt in the Abzu, the primordial freshwater ocean beneath the earth. Enki, who would again and again intervene on humanity's behalf, even against the explicit wishes of his fellow gods Enki, whose cunning and compassion would prove decisive when the time of judgment finally came. The Divine Council met in assembly to decide the great matters of cosmic governance, and the tablets preserve records of their debates, their disagreements, their collective decisions that shaped the fate of worlds. And in these records we glimpse a pantheon that was not monolithic, but divided with factions and alliances, with gods who favored humanity and gods who viewed the human experiment with growing displeasure. Enlil, Lord of the Air and the Earth Commander of the Divine Decrees, viewed humanity with increasingly jaundiced eyes. For the creatures multiplied rapidly. They filled the land with their noise and their numbers. They consumed the resources that should have fed the gods. Their prayers rose as ceaseless clamor to the heavens. And in the heart of Enlil, a decision began to form. These creatures had become a burden, not a blessing, a problem to be solved, not a project to be nurtured. Picture the ziggurat in the ancient city of Eridu, rising in its 7-colored tiers, each level painted a different sacred hue. each level bringing the priests who climbed its stairs closer to the platform at the summit where the god was set to descend. And imagine the smoke rising from the offerings carried up those stairs. The smell of roasted grain and slaughtered livestock drifting across the flat landscape, while below in the cramped houses and narrow streets, the ordinary people went about their lives, never knowing that far above in councils they could not hear. Their fate was being weighed in the balance. The tablets that record these matters are not scriptures, in the sense that later religions would understand that word. They are not unified documents of faith, but fragments, hymns and narratives and ritual texts and mythological accounts that were copied and recopied over centuries, sometimes altered in the copying, sometimes combined with other sources, sometimes corrupted by scribal errors or deliberate theological revision. And what we possess today is only a fraction of what once existed. Perhaps one tablet in 100 survives. Perhaps one story in 1,000 has come down to us intact. And yet what survives is enough to outline a narrative of creation and destruction, of judgment and mercy, of bloodlines marked for extinction and one bloodline marked for survival. Among these surviving tablets are accounts of a great flood that the gods sent to destroy humanity, a flood that appears not only in Sumerian literature but in the Akkadian texts that followed, and in the Babylonian versions that came later, still and ultimately in the Hebrew scriptures that would shape the religious imagination of half the world. And the existence of this flood narrative across so many cultures and so many centuries raises questions that have never been fully answered, questions about what actually happened in the deep past of human memory, questions about why the gods sought to destroy what they had created, and questions about how anyone survived at all. The Sumerian flood hero is called Ziusudra, whose name means life of long days. In the Akkadian versions, he becomes Utnapishtim, he who found life, and in the Hebrew scriptures, he becomes Noah, the righteous man who found favor in the eyes of God. But beneath these different names and different cultural contexts, the story remains remarkably consistent. The gods decide to destroy humanity by flood. One god chooses to warn one man that man builds a vessel and survives with his family and with representatives of animal life. And when the waters recede, humanity begins again emerging from catastrophe into a new and chastened world. But the commonly told version of this story, the version that has echoed through Sunday schools and cinema screens, leaves out crucial details that the tablets preserve, details about why the gods made their terrible decision. Details about the divisions within the divine council. Details about different kinds of human beings created at different times for different purposes. Details that suggest the flood was not merely divine punishment for human sin, but something far more complex, far more targeted, far more deliberate, an extinction event designed to eliminate certain bloodlines while allowing one to survive. What the tablets suggest, and what scholars have debated, and what we will explore in the hours to come, is that humanity was not created once, but several times. That different creative acts produced different kinds of human beings, with different characteristics and different fates, that some of these bloodlines displeased the gods through failures inherent in their very design, while one bloodline alone possessed the qualities that would allow it to endure, and that the flood was the mechanism by which the divine council sought to reset the experiment, to clear away the failures and begin again with only the successful strain remaining. We stand now at the threshold of deep waters. We have established the context, the world of ancient Sumer, the gift of writing the pantheon of heaven and earth, the council of gods who debated humanity's fate. We have learned how the tablets were buried and found and deciphered, and we have glimpsed the outlines of a story far older and far stranger than the simplified versions we thought we knew. And now we must descend further into the darkness of that ancient past, following the fragments and the whispers and the traces that remain until we reach the heart of the mystery, the 5 bloodlines that the Anunnaki marked for extinction, and the one bloodline that survived to become us all. And so we turn now to the heart of our mystery, to the ancient accounts that speak of humanity's creation not as a single miraculous event, but as a process, a series of attempts, each one building upon the failures of what came before, and to understand what the tablets reveal about the 5 bloodlines marked for extinction. We must first journey back to a time before humans walked the earth, a time when the gods themselves labored under the weight of cosmic work. For the Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest and most complete creation narratives to survive from ancient Mesopotamia, tells us that in the beginning there were only the gods, the great Anunnaki who ruled from their celestial thrones, and the lesser Igigi, who were tasked with the brutal work of maintaining the world, digging the channels that would become the Tigris and Euphrates, carving the irrigation ditches, hauling the endless baskets of earth. And for 40 years, the Igigi labored, their divine bodies bent to tasks that seemed to have no end, until at last they could bear it no longer, and they rose up in rebellion, setting fire to their tools and surrounding the dwelling of Enlil in the night, demanding release from their eternal servitude. And this moment of divine crisis, this uprising among the gods themselves, set in motion the chain of events that would lead to humanity's creation and, eventually, to the judgment that nearly destroyed us all. The tablets tell us that the great gods, faced with this rebellion, gathered in council to determine what should be done, for the work still needed doing, the channels still needed digging, the world still required maintenance. But the Igigi would no longer submit to such labor. And it was then that Enki, the god of wisdom and sweet waters, he who dwelt in the Abzu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth, proposed a solution that would change the cosmos forever. Let us create a new being, he suggested, a creature that will bear the yoke of the gods, that will do the work the Igigi refuse. And to accomplish this creation, the gods chose one among themselves for sacrifice, a god called Geshtue, whose name some scholars translate as a god of understanding or intelligence. And in a scene of terrible solemnity, the other gods took this divine being and slew him, mixing his blood and his flesh with clay from the earth. And from this mixture of the divine and the earthly, the first humans were fashioned, bearing within them forever the trace of godhood, the ghost of divine consciousness that came from Geshtui's sacrifice. And so humanity was born not from love or from cosmic accident, but from practical necessity, created to serve, to labor, to free the gods from work they no longer wished to perform. But the tablets suggest, and here we must acknowledge, that we are entering territory where interpretation and speculation begin to blend with established text, that this first creation was not entirely successful, that the beings produced from that initial mixture of divine blood and earthly clay were not quite what the gods had envisioned. For scattered throughout Sumerian and Babylonian literature, we find references to failed attempts at creation, to beings that emerged malformed or incomplete, creatures that could not reproduce themselves, that could not hold their shape, that lacked the spark of consciousness necessary to follow instructions and perform complex tasks. And some scholars have suggested that these references point to a process of trial and error, of divine experimentation as the gods worked to perfect their creation, discarding failures and refining their techniques until at last they achieved something workable, something that could fulfill the purpose for which humanity was intended. This concept of failed prototypes may seem strange to modern ears accustomed to creation narratives in which humanity emerges fully formed and perfect from the hands of the divine. But it appears in various forms across world mythology, now from Greek tales of earlier races of humans who were destroyed and replaced, to Mesoamerican accounts of multiple attempts at creation before the current humanity came into being. And within this framework of successive creation attempts, some researchers have proposed an interpretive lens through which to understand the disparate and sometimes contradictory references to human origins found across the Sumerian tablets. The notion that what we are seeing is not one creation story told in different ways, but rather accounts of multiple distinct creations, each producing a different type of human being, each representing a refinement or modification of what came before. And it is this framework, held lightly as one possible reading among many, that gives us the concept of the 5 bloodlines. The first of these bloodlines, according to this interpretation, would have been the original creation. Those beings made from the mixture of Geshtui's divine essence with the clay of the earth, shaped for one purpose above all others: to labor, to dig, to carry, to perform the physical work that sustained the cosmic order. And if we imagine these first humans through the lens of this speculative framework, we might picture beings of tremendous physical strength but limited consciousness, creatures whose divine spark was just sufficient to follow simple commands, to lift and carry and dig without questioning why, whose lifespans were perhaps mercifully short given the brutality of their existence, who lived and worked and died in the shadows of the great ziggurats, their bodies returning to the clay from which they had been drawn. Picture them, if you will, in the pre-dawn darkness, rising from their mud brick shelters to begin another day of labor, their hands already calloused beyond feeling, their backs bent from years of carrying impossible loads, moving in silent rows toward the irrigation channels that needed endless maintenance, toward the temple foundations that required endless baskets of earth, knowing nothing of prayer or beauty or the names of the stars, knowing only the work and the brief rest, and then the work again. And perhaps the gods looking down upon these creatures felt something like satisfaction, for the channels were being dug and the Igigi were free to take their places among the celestial hierarchy. But perhaps, too, there was something missing, some quality that these laboring beings lacked, and some capacity for worship and wonder that the gods found they desired from their creation. And so the limitations of this first bloodline became apparent, not as failure exactly, but as incompleteness, as a first draft in what would become a longer story. And so we come to the second bloodline, and here the pattern begins to emerge that will repeat throughout this tale of creation and disappointment. For having made beings who could labor but could not truly comprehend, the gods turned their attention to creating something more refined, more capable of understanding and participating in the cosmic order that the Anunnaki had established. And according to this interpretive framework, the second bloodline were the servants, beings created not for the fields and the channels, but for the temples and the sacred precincts. Creatures given greater intelligence and longer lives, blessed with the ability to understand ritual and prayer, to perform the complex ceremonies that sustained the relationship between earth and heaven, to speak the ancient words and make the proper offerings, to tend the statues of the gods and prepare their meals and sing the hymns that rose like incense toward the sky. We might imagine these temple servants moving through sacred spaces in the hours before dawn, their footsteps soft on floors that had been swept clean of every grain of dust, their hands steady as they placed offerings of bread and beer before the divine images, their lips forming the ancient prayers that had been taught to them by the priests who came before. And unlike the workers of the first bloodline, these servants understood what they were doing and comprehended the significance of each gesture and each word, felt the weight of the sacred duties they performed. And this understanding, this consciousness that the gods had granted them, was both their greatest gift and the seed of their undoing. For consciousness, once kindled, is not easily contained, and the beings who understood ritual eventually began to understand other things as well, began to ask questions that servants should not ask, began to wonder why the gods required such constant tending, began to remember the old stories and perceive the contradictions within them, began to look at the divine images they served and see not the gods themselves, but merely statues of wood and precious metal, began to whisper among themselves in the darkness of the temple storerooms. And somewhere in the fragmentary texts, there are references to beings who spoke back to the gods, who demanded answers, who refused the simple obedience that was their created purpose. And this capacity for questioning, this dangerous gift of awareness, marked the second bloodline as flawed in ways the gods had not anticipated. The Sumerians had a concept called the me, the divine decrees or civilizational principles that governed every aspect of existence, from the proper way to perform a ritual to the correct structure of a household, to the nature of kingship itself. And the me were not merely laws, but something more fundamental, the essential patterns by which the cosmos was organized. And to understand the me was to understand how reality itself was constructed. And perhaps the servants of the second bloodline came too close to this understanding, began to perceive the machinery behind the temple curtains, began to see that the cosmic order was not inevitable, but had been designed. And designed things can be questioned, and questioned things can be changed. And those who ask too many questions become dangerous regardless of how faithfully they perform their other duties. The third bloodline represented yet another attempt to solve the problem of creation. And here the gods made what might seem like a counterintuitive choice. Rather than limiting human consciousness further to prevent the questioning that had marred the second creation, they instead chose to elevate a select group of humans to positions of authority, creating beings with greater divine essence than any who had come before. The beings who would serve as intermediaries between the heavenly and earthly realms, who would rule over other humans in the name of the gods, who would bear the weight of divine favor and divine responsibility. And these were the priest kings, the first monarchs who claimed their right to rule not through conquest or inheritance, but through direct connection to the Anunnaki themselves. The concept of divine kingship was central to Sumerian civilization, so deeply embedded that the earliest historical records we possess take the form of king lists that trace royal authority back to the moment when kingship descended from heaven. And in the framework we are exploring, the third bloodline would have been the original bearers of this divine mandate, humans who had been deliberately infused with a greater portion of godhood, who could speak with the gods and convey their will to the masses, who sat upon thrones of lapis lazuli and gold, their crowns shaped to echo the horned headdresses of the divine, their every word carrying the weight of cosmic authority. Imagine a figure seated in the great hall of a palace that would itself become legend, the walls adorned with scenes of conquest and tribute, the air thick with incense and the murmur of courtiers, and upon the throne a being who was neither fully human nor fully divine, but something in between, someone who could look upon the images of the gods and see not masters, but something closer to equals, someone who could command and expect obedience not merely from servants, but from the very forces of nature. And perhaps for a time this arrangement worked. Perhaps the priest-kings fulfilled their intended purpose, managing human affairs on behalf of the divine council, ensuring that offerings flowed upward and blessings flowed down, maintaining the balance that allowed both heaven and earth to flourish. But pride, that ancient flaw that appears in mythologies around the world, found fertile soil in the hearts of these elevated beings, and the same divine essence that gave them authority also gave them ambition. And the kings who had been created to serve the gods began to imagine themselves as gods in their own right, began to build monuments, not to the Anunnaki, but to their own glory, began to reach toward heaven not in worship, but in competition. And here some scholars hear echoes of the Tower of Babel story, that ancient account of human ambition checked by divine intervention. And whether we are reading a single narrative refracted through multiple traditions or separate accounts that happen to converge, the theme remains consistent. The third bloodline fell because they forgot their place, because they mistook the portion of divinity within them for divinity itself, because they built their towers brick upon brick toward a heaven that had never been promised to them. And so, the pattern completes itself once more, creation followed by purpose, followed by flaw, followed by judgment. And we can sense in the divine council a growing frustration, a dawning realization that the creation of humanity might itself have been a mistake, that each attempt to refine and improve the original design only introduced new problems, new ways for these creatures of clay and divine blood to disappoint their makers. And the fourth bloodline represented perhaps the most dramatic departure from what had come before, for having created laborers who could not think, and servants who thought too much, and kings who thought themselves divine, the gods now turned to creating warriors, beings of tremendous size and power who could serve in the great conflicts among the gods themselves, who could be weapons in the celestial struggles that periodically shook the cosmos. And these were the giants, creatures whose footsteps shook the earth, whose appetites knew no satisfaction, whose capacity for violence exceeded anything the world had yet seen. Here we find potential connections to other ancient traditions, to the biblical Nephilim, who were said to be the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men, due to the giants of Greek mythology who warred against the Olympians, to the titanic figures that appear in the myths of cultures around the world, and whether these parallels represent a shared memory of actual events or simply a common symbolic language for expressing the dangers of unchecked power. The fourth bloodline in our framework represents the moment when the gods overreached, when their experiments in creation produced something they could not control. The giants served their purpose in the divine conflicts for which they had been created. But when those conflicts ended, the giants did not, their violent natures finding new outlets in the world below, their enormous appetites consuming more than the earth could provide, their presence disrupting the balance that the earlier bloodlines had at least partially maintained. And the other humans, the workers and the servants, and even the proud priest-kings, lived in terror of these tremendous beings who had been their siblings in creation. And the earth groaned under the weight of their depredations, and the cries of the suffering rose to heaven. And the gods who had made the giants found themselves facing the consequences of their own creative ambition. It was at this moment, with 4 failed bloodlines walking the earth, with the divine council gathering to debate whether the entire experiment of humanity should be abandoned, whether the waters of chaos should be released to wash the world clean and return everything to the primordial state before creation, that something unexpected occurred in the underwater temple called the Abzu, in the dwelling place of Enki, the god of wisdom and sweet waters, he who had first proposed the creation of humanity, and who had watched each successive bloodline rise and fall with something that might have been called sorrow, if gods could feel such things. For Enki, alone among the great gods, had developed a bond with his creation, had come to see humanity not merely as tools or servants or failed experiments, but as something precious in their own right, beings who carried within them a portion of divine essence and who had developed, despite all their flaws, the capacity for love and wonder and creativity, the ability to make music and tell stories and find beauty in a world that had not been made for them. And as Enki heard the debates in the divine council, as he listened to Enlil argue for total destruction and watched the other gods nod in agreement, he knew that he could not simply let his creation vanish beneath the waves. And so, in secret, while the council debated and the storms gathered at the edges of the world, Enki undertook one final act of creation, crafting a 5th bloodline, unlike any that had come before, beings who did not stand out from the others in size or strength or obvious divine attributes, but who carried within them something different, something more resilient, more adaptable, more capable of surviving whatever catastrophe was to come. And he scattered these new humans among the existing populations, made them indistinguishable to divine surveillance, hid them in plain sight among the workers and the servants and the kings, knowing that when the waters came and the other bloodlines perished, these hidden ones would endure, would carry forward the divine spark that had been planted in clay so long ago, would justify his faith in the beings he had helped to make. And perhaps, as Enki worked in the darkness of the Abzu, as he shaped this final bloodline with all the wisdom he had gained from watching the others fail, he whispered to them secrets that would help them survive, taught them to listen for divine guidance, even when it came indirectly, instilled in them the capacity for hope that would sustain them through the darkness to come. And when his work was finished and these new humans went out into the world, unaware of their own difference, unaware that they had been marked not for extinction, but for survival, Enki returned to his place in the divine council and said nothing and waited for the floods to begin. The tablets tell us that in those ancient days before the great waters came, there was a gathering in the heavens unlike any that had occurred before, and the great gods of the Anunnaki assembled in their celestial court to decide the fate of all that breathed upon the earth. And we must imagine this scene if we can allow ourselves to picture it. The throne room of the divine council stretching beyond mortal comprehension, the air thick with the weight of eternal beings contemplating an irreversible act, and Anu, the father of the heavens, presided over this assembly, while Enlil, the lord of the air and commander of the earthly realm, rose to speak his grievances against the creatures that walked below. For the tablets record his words in fragments that have survived the millennia, telling us that humanity had become a noise upon the earth, a clamour that disturbed the sleep of the gods, a chaos that could no longer be tolerated. And though these words may seem strange to us, now we must understand that in the Sumerian conception of the cosmos, the relationship between gods and humans was never one of unconditional love, but rather a pragmatic arrangement wherein humans served and gods received. And when that arrangement became unbalanced, the divine response was not reformation, but annihilation. And so Enlil spoke to the assembled council of the failures they had witnessed across the generations, how the first bloodline created for labor had proven too limited in consciousness to properly serve, how the second bloodline of temple servants had grown too aware and begun to question their masters, how the third bloodline of priest-kings had built monuments to their own glory rather than to the gods who made them, and how the fourth bloodline of giants had become a terror upon the earth, consuming everything in their path, until even the gods themselves felt threatened by what they had made. And as Enlil spoke, the other great gods listened, and many found themselves nodding in agreement, for they too had grown weary of the human experiment. They too had watched creation after creation fail to meet divine expectations, and one by one the gods raised their hands in solemn vote until the decree was passed and the fate of humanity was sealed. But there was one among them who did not raise his hand, one who sat in silence as his fellow gods condemned his creations to extinction. And this was Enki, the Lord of wisdom and sweet waters. He who had shaped humanity from clay and divine blood, he who had given them the spark of consciousness that made them more than mere beasts of burden. And the tablets tell us that Enki, alone among the great gods, voted against the destruction, though his lone dissent couldn't change what had been decreed. And here we find one of the most poignant moments in all of Sumerian literature, a god who loved his creation, outvoted by those who saw humanity as merely a failed experiment. And yet the council demanded more than mere agreement. They demanded an oath of secrecy, for the gods knew that if humanity were warned of the coming destruction, they might find some way to survive. And so each god in turn swore never to reveal the council's decision to any living human. And Enki too was forced to take this oath, though his heart rebelled against it with every word. And we must pause here to consider the mechanism of destruction that the council chose, for they might have sent plague to sweep through human settlements as they had done before. They might have released famine to slowly starve humanity into extinction. They might have unleashed wild beasts or demons to hunt down every man, woman, and child. But instead, they chose water, the great flood, the deluge that would cleanse the earth of all that crawled and walked and breathed. And there is deep symbolism in this choice that we can still appreciate across the vast gulf of time. For water in Sumerian cosmology was the primal element from which all things emerged. The Abzu, the freshwater abyss, and Tiamat, the saltwater chaos, had existed before the gods themselves brought order to the universe. And so to destroy humanity with water was to return creation to its original state, to unmake what had been made, to dissolve the formed back into the formless, and the flood would be complete and total, leaving no high ground where survivors might cling to life, no caves where families might shelter, no mountains tall enough to rise above the waters, or so the gods believed. And as they planned this annihilation, we can imagine them considering how each bloodline would meet its end. The workers of the first creation, toiling in the low fields where the rivers would overflow first. The temple servants of the second creation, trapped in the basement chambers where sacred objects were stored. The priest kings of the third creation in their palace complexes that would become watery tombs. And the giants of the fourth creation whose massive bodies would be dragged down by their own weight, unable to swim, unable to float, unable to escape the rising waters, and the gods must have felt satisfaction as they contemplated this cleansing, this return to a world without the noise and chaos of human civilization. But they had not counted on Enki. They had not anticipated that the god of wisdom would find a way to honor the letter of his oath while violating its spirit. And here we come to one of the most beautiful scenes in all of ancient literature, a moment of divine love expressed through clever circumvention. For Enki could not warn humanity directly. He had sworn an oath, and even gods are bound by their sacred words. But Enki was the god of wisdom, and wisdom finds a way where brute force cannot. And so, one night, if we may call it night in those mythic times before the flood, Enki came to the city of Shuruppak, where a man named Ziusudra lived, a man who was pious and humble and attentive to divine things. And Enki did not enter the house. He did not speak to Ziusudra face to face. Instead, he stood outside the humble dwelling and spoke to the reed wall itself, the woven reeds that form the boundary between inside and outside, and the tablets preserve his words for us across 5,000 years. Reed wall, pay attention to my words. Wall, listen to what I tell you. And Enki spoke to the wall about the council's decision, about the flood that would come, about the need to build a boat of specific dimensions, about the animals and seeds and craftspeople that must be gathered. And all the while Ziusudra pressed his ear to the other side of that reed wall, hearing everything, though technically nothing had been said to him. And we can feel the tenderness beneath this cleverness, the desperate hope contained in this legal fiction, for Enki was risking everything to save what he loved, finding a loophole not for selfish gain, but for the preservation of the beings he had brought into existence. And Ziusudra listened, and Ziusudra understood. And when the voice fell silent, he knew what he must do. And the tablets tell us that he worked without rest to construct the vessel that would carry survival through the destruction to come, following the divine dimensions that had been spoken to the wall, building a boat of impossible size, a craft that would have seemed mad to his neighbors who could not know what was coming. And yet Ziusudra persisted, gathering animals 2 by 2, collecting seeds of every plant, assembling craftspeople who held the knowledge of civilization in their hands and minds. And on the 7th day, the work was complete, and the sky had already begun to darken at the edges of the world. And what came next, the tablets describe in terms that still carry power across the millennia. The south wind blew for an instant. The north wind blew for an instant. And these simple words contain within them the complete destruction of a world. For when the winds came, they brought waters such as the earth had never seen, waters from above and waters from below. The boundaries between sky and sea dissolving until there was no difference between the two. And the noise of the deluge was so terrible that even the gods cowered in their heavenly seats. Even the immortal ones who had decreed this destruction found themselves trembling at what they had unleashed, and across the flooded earth, 4 bloodlines met their end. All the workers and servants and priest kings and giants, all the songs they had sung, and the tools they had made, and the dreams they had dreamed, all of it swallowed by waters that knew no mercy, because water knows nothing at all. And the tablets tell us that Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, wept for the humans she had helped create, crying out that she had agreed to this evil, that she had voted for the destruction of her own children. And we hear in her lament something that approaches divine regret, something that suggests even gods can act in haste and repent in sorrow. And as the waters covered everything, the gods grew hungry, for they had not considered that without humanity there would be no one to offer sacrifices, no one to burn the sweet smoke that nourished the divine beings, no temples where priests would chant their praises, and this hunger was a revelation, an unwanted understanding that the relationship between gods and humans was not simply one of master and servant, but something more complex, something approaching mutual need. And meanwhile, upon the endless dark waters, a single vessel floated, carrying within it the remnants of hope. And Ziusudra and his household drifted in a world that had no landmarks, no horizon, no certainty, except the wooden walls that kept the waters at bay, and they survived because of qualities that the other bloodlines had lacked. Adaptability in the face of absolute change, humility that allowed them to hear divine guidance even when it came indirectly through a reed wall, hope that persisted even when all evidence suggested that hope was foolish. And these were the qualities of the 5th bloodline, the hidden creation that Enki had woven into the human tapestry without the knowledge of the council. And for 7 days they floated as the rains continued, and the waters rose ever higher, until even the mountains disappeared beneath the waves. And then came silence, a stillness so complete that it must have seemed like another kind of death, the death of sound itself, and slowly, imperceptibly. At first, the waters began to recede, and Ziusudra sent out a dove that returned having found no place to rest, and he sent out a swallow that also returned with exhausted wings. And finally, he sent out a raven that flew away into the grey light and did not return. And this absence was the presence of hope. This failure to return was the success of survival, for somewhere out there was dry land, solid ground, a place where life could begin again. And the tablets tell us that the ark came to rest upon a mountain called Nisia, though other versions give other names. And Ziusudra opened the door of the vessel and breathed fresh air for the first time in weeks, air that did not smell of animals and fear and confinement, air that carried the strange scent of a world washed clean. And his first act upon solid ground was to build an altar and make an offering to the gods, burning sweet herbs and fat that sent smoke rising into the sky. And the tablets describe what happened next in terms that are almost shocking in their honesty. For they say that the gods gathered around the sacrifice like flies, hungry and eager for the nourishment that only human worship could provide. And there is something almost pathetic in this image of divine beings who had destroyed nearly all of humanity, now desperate for the offering of the few survivors. And yet, there is also something beautiful in it, something that speaks to the interdependence of all things mortal and immortal alike. And when Enlil arrived and saw that there were survivors, his rage was terrible to behold. He who had decreed the destruction now faced evidence that his decree had failed, and he turned on his fellow gods, demanding to know who had broken the oath, who had warned the humans, who had allowed this remnant to escape the waters. And all eyes turned to Enki, who stood calm in the face of divine fury. And Enki's defense was as clever as his original circumvention had been. For he pointed out with perfect logic that he had not warned any human of anything. He had merely spoken to a reed wall, and if the wall happened to be thin enough for words to pass through, and if a human happened to be listening on the other side, this was not a violation of his oath, but merely an unfortunate circumstance of architecture. And the tablets do not tell us whether the other gods found this argument convincing or simply admired the audacity of it. But they do tell us that Enlil's rage slowly transformed into something else as he looked upon Ziusudra and his family. For here were humans who had heard the voice of a god through a wall and acted upon it without hesitation. Here were humans who had built an impossible boat on faith alone. Here were humans who had preserved life through the apocalypse and emerged to offer worship before taking food for themselves. And perhaps Enlil saw in them something that the previous bloodlines had lacked. Perhaps he recognized that these survivors possessed the very qualities that made humanity worth preserving after all: humility and faith and gratitude and resilience. And so the Lord of the Air made a covenant with the remnant of humanity, promising that never again would the gods send waters to destroy all flesh. And this promise was recorded on tablets that were copied and recopied across centuries until they came to us. And in return for this divine restraint, humanity accepted certain limitations, mortality chief among them. For the survivors and their descendants would not live forever as the antediluvian kings had lived. Their spans would be measured in decades rather than centuries. And this mortality was perhaps the greatest wisdom of all. For beings who know they will die are less likely to build towers to challenge the heavens, less likely to forget their place in the order of things, less likely to repeat the failures of the 4 bloodlines that had perished beneath the waves. And so from the mountaintop where the ark had come to rest, a new chapter of human history began, written in the blood of the 5th bloodline, the survivors, the adaptable ones, the listeners. And if the tablets tell us true, then we who exist today are their descendants, carrying within us the qualities that allowed them to endure when all others perished, carrying within us some small echo of the divine essence that Enki wove into clay so long ago, carrying within us the memory of waters that rose and fell and rose again only in story now. And the covenant holds: the rains fall, but the floods do not consume the earth. And we continue, we persist, we survive as we have always survived, because something in our making was designed for exactly this: for hearing truth through walls, for building boats on faith, for emerging from darkness to offer gratitude before asking for anything in return. When the waters finally receded, and Ziusudra stepped from the vessel onto the muddy slopes of that sacred mountain, he carried with him far more than his own survival. For within the ark's chambers lay the accumulated wisdom of an entire age, the me as the Sumerians called them, those divine decrees and sacred arts that made civilization possible. And these treasures of knowledge included the secrets of agriculture and irrigation, the principles of astronomy and mathematics, the arts of metallurgy and medicine, the sacred hymns and ritual practices that maintained the bond between earth and heaven, and perhaps most precious of all, the memories of what had been lost, the stories of the 4 bloodlines who had walked the earth and vanished beneath the waves, their triumphs and their failures preserved now only in the telling, and this weight of being the last, the only ones remaining to remember and to continue, must have pressed heavily upon those survivors as they descended from the mountain to begin the work of rebuilding a world emptied of all they had known. And we find evidence of this great division in time within one of the most remarkable documents to survive from ancient Sumer, the text known today as the Sumerian King List, which records the reigns of rulers stretching back into the mists of prehistory. And what makes this document so fascinating is how it divides all of history into 2 distinct epochs. For the scribes who composed it clearly mark the boundary with words that echo across millennia. Then the flood swept over, and after the flood had swept over, kingship descended from heaven once more. And before this great dividing line, the kings listed reign for impossibly long periods. Tens of thousands of years attributed to single rulers, lifespans that seem to belong to another order of being entirely. But after the flood, these numbers gradually normalize, shrinking generation by generation until they approach the human scale we recognize. And scholars have long debated what this might mean, whether it represents a different counting system, a mythological convention, or something else entirely. But within the framework of the 5 bloodlines we have been exploring, one interpretation suggests itself that perhaps the 5th bloodline carried within it a different relationship with time, a more bounded existence, mortality itself being part of what made this creation sustainable, where others had failed. For the earlier bloodlines, with their extended spans, had time enough to accumulate pride, to forget their origins, to challenge the very gods who made them, while the 5th bloodline, knowing that their days were numbered, might retain the humility that comes with limitation. And so we might understand the gift of mortality not as a punishment, but as a protection, a boundary that keeps humanity in right relationship with the powers above and the earth below. And when we consider what qualities allowed the 5th bloodline to survive when all others perished, certain patterns emerge from the ancient accounts. For Ziusudra is portrayed not as the strongest or the cleverest or the most ambitious of men, but as one who listened, who remained attentive to the whispers of the divine even when they came indirectly through the reeds of a wall. And this quality of receptive attention, of being willing to hear and to act even when the message is uncertain and the path unclear, appears again and again in the surviving descriptions of those who pleased the gods. And alongside this listening quality, we find adaptability, the capacity to respond to changing circumstances with creativity rather than rigidity. For when Ziusudra was told to build a vessel unlike anything that had existed before, he did not protest that it was impossible or cling to familiar ways, but set himself to the strange new task with whatever skills and resources he possessed. And this combination of humble receptivity and creative adaptability, balanced with the technical knowledge preserved from the ages before, formed the inheritance that the survivors carried forward into the New World. And we can trace how this inheritance passed from generation to generation through the great civilizations that rose in the wake of the flood. For the Sumerian stories and traditions did not end with Sumer itself, but flowed outward like the rivers that had given that civilization life, passing first to the Akkadians who conquered and absorbed Sumerian culture, preserving the old stories while translating them into their own Semitic tongue, and then to the Babylonians, who raised Great Babylon on the plains and compiled their own versions of the ancient tales. And the scribes of these later empires copied and recopied the old tablets, sometimes preserving them exactly and sometimes adapting them to new contexts and concerns. And fragments of these copies have been found scattered across the ancient Near East, the evidence of a tradition that spread far beyond its origins. And scholars have long noted the striking parallels between these Mesopotamian flood narratives and the account preserved in the Hebrew scriptures, though they debate the nature and direction of influence, some arguing for direct borrowing, and others for common descent from even older traditions. And whatever the precise relationship, the persistence of the story across so many cultures and centuries speaks to something deep in human memory, a narrative so significant that it could not be forgotten. And indeed, when we look beyond the ancient Near East, we find flood narratives appearing in traditions around the world, among peoples separated by vast oceans and impassable mountains, in China and India, among the indigenous peoples of the Americas and the Pacific Islands. And while some of these parallels may be coincidental or may reflect later contact and transmission, the sheer ubiquity of the flood narrative raises questions that resist easy answers. For if some great deluge did occur in the distant past, a cataclysm significant enough to imprint itself upon the memory of humanity across all its scattered branches, then perhaps these diverse traditions are indeed echoes of a single overwhelming event, carried forward independently by survivors who spread across the earth in the aftermath. And this brings us to consider what it might mean if we, all of us listening to these words in the present day, are indeed the descendants of that survival, the inheritors of whatever qualities Enki instilled in his secret creation, the fifth bloodline that slipped through the judgment of the gods. And if this is so, then we carry within us the legacy of that ancient selection, the characteristics that allowed our ancestors to hear the warning, to build the ark, to ride out the destruction, and to begin again when the waters withdrew. And perhaps we might recognize these qualities when we find them in ourselves and in one another. The capacity to adapt when circumstances demand it, the humility to listen even when the message is unwelcome, the creativity to solve problems that have never been faced before, the persistence to continue building even when everything has been lost, and the faith to maintain connection with something larger than ourselves, even when that connection is tenuous and uncertain, and whether we understand this larger something as the divine in the traditional sense or as something else entirely, as the accumulated wisdom of our ancestors, as the natural order of the cosmos, or simply as the better possibilities within our own nature, the pattern remains the same. That survival and flourishing depend upon remaining in relationship with powers and principles beyond our individual control. And so, the story of the fifth bloodline becomes not merely an ancient curiosity, but a mirror in which we might glimpse our own reflection, an invitation to consider what qualities we choose to cultivate and what inheritance we will pass along to those who come after us. For we too are links in an unbroken chain that stretches back through the millennia to those first survivors on the mountainside and forward into a future we cannot foresee. And the same stars that shone over Sumer shine tonight over wherever you find yourself listening to these words. The same ancient light falling on faces separated by 5,000 years, but joined by something deeper than time. And this connection, this recognition across the ages, is itself part of what the survivors carried forward. The knowledge that we are not alone in our wandering, that others before us have looked up at the night sky and asked the same questions about who we are and where we came from and why we remain when so much else has vanished. And in the archaeological sites of Mesopotamia, in the ruins of cities that rose and fell before Rome was dreamed of, excavators have found layers of silt and clay that some interpret as evidence of significant flooding events. And while scholars debate whether any of these deposits correspond to a flood of the magnitude described in the ancient texts, or whether multiple local floods have merged in cultural memory into a single overwhelming narrative, the presence of these flood layers reminds us that the earth itself keeps records, and that somewhere beneath the tells and the sand there may lie evidence of events we have yet to uncover or understand. And this is where humility becomes essential, for the archaeological record is fragmentary, and our interpretations are provisional, and we must hold our conclusions lightly, even as we pursue them seriously, recognizing that future discoveries may transform our understanding of what happened in those distant ages. And perhaps this, too, is part of the inheritance of the fifth bloodline. This capacity to live with uncertainty without being paralyzed by it, to continue asking questions even when answers remain elusive, and to find peace in the mystery rather than demanding a resolution that may never come. And when we consider the persistence of stories about gods and floods and survival across so many cultures and centuries, we might ask what it is about these narratives that makes them so enduring. Why human beings across all our diversity continue to tell tales of divine beings descending from the heavens, of cataclysms that swept away the old world, and of survivors who carried the seeds of renewal through the destruction. And one answer might be that these stories encode psychological truths that remain relevant regardless of their historical accuracy, speaking to our experience of loss and resilience, of judgment and mercy, of endings that contain within them the possibility of new beginnings. And perhaps the memory of gods is really the memory of any overwhelming power that shapes our lives without our consent. And perhaps the memory of the flood is the memory of every catastrophe that has swept away what we built and loved. And perhaps the memory of survival is the recognition that despite everything, we are still here, still telling stories, still reaching toward understanding. And if we are the fifth bloodline, then what might this mean for how we live today, for what qualities we choose to cultivate in ourselves and encourage in our children, and the failures of the other bloodlines offer warnings that remain relevant, for the workers lost themselves in endless toil without reflection, and the servants became trapped in their own cleverness, and the priest-kings fell to pride and the desire to make themselves equal to the gods, and the giants embodied strength without restraint, power without wisdom, appetite without limit. And each of these failures represents a human tendency that remains with us, temptations that we face individually and collectively as we navigate our own complex age. And perhaps the story of the 5 bloodlines is finally a story about balance, about the need to work without losing ourselves in work, to think without becoming lost in abstraction, to lead without forgetting that we too are led, and to exercise power with the restraint that comes from remembering our own mortality and limitation. And the 5th bloodline survived because it contained within itself a different proportion of these elements, enough humility to listen, enough creativity to adapt, enough strength to endure, and enough wisdom to know the difference between what can be changed and what must be accepted. And these remain the qualities that sustain us still. And as you listen to these words, perhaps in the quiet hours of evening, when the world has grown soft and slow, you might consider that you are participating in something ancient. For this story has been told and retold for 5,000 years, passed from voice to voice and mind to mind across more generations than we can easily count. And every telling has been slightly different, shaped by the teller and the listener and the circumstances of their meeting. And yet, something essential has persisted through all these variations, some kernel of meaning that refuses to be lost. And you are now part of that transmission, having heard what the ancient scribes wrote, and what the survivors remembered, and what Enki whispered to the reeds. And what you do with this inheritance is your own to decide, whether you hold it as history or myth or metaphor, whether you pass it along to others or let it settle into the quiet places of your own contemplation. And either way, the story has reached you across an unimaginable gulf of time. And in reaching you, it has survived another day, another listener, another link in the chain that stretches back to the mountain where the ark came to rest, and forward into whatever world our own descendants will inherit. And the qualities of the 5th bloodline are not locked in the past, but present now in this moment, as you listen and wonder and perhaps begin to drift towards sleep. And if adaptability and humility and creativity and connection were what allowed our ancestors to survive the judgment of the gods, then these same qualities remain available to us as we face our own uncertain futures. And the divine spark that Enki placed within his secret creation, however diluted by the generations, still flickers somewhere within each of us, a capacity for wonder, a hunger for meaning, a persistent hope that endures despite everything we have learned about the indifference of the cosmos. And perhaps this hope is itself the truest inheritance. The flame passed from hand to hand through the darkness, and you who have listened this far, you too carry that flame, whether you know it or not. And the story that began with tablets buried in the ruins of Nineveh now continues in your own consciousness, mingling with your own memories and questions and dreams. And what seemed distant and foreign has become intimate and present. For the 5th bloodline is not only an ancient category, but a living reality, the thread that connects the first survivors to you yourself as you listen in whatever place and time has received you, and the stars continue their ancient circuits overhead, the same patterns that the Sumerian priests traced from their ziggurats, now visible still to anyone who steps outside and looks up with wondering eyes. And if there are questions that remain unanswered, if the mystery has not been fully dispelled by all our research and interpretation, perhaps this is as it should be, for some truths are too large to be captured in any single telling, and some inheritances are meant to be lived rather than merely understood. And as the night deepens and these words begin to fade into the comfortable silence, you might let the story settle into whatever place within you receives such things, trusting that it will continue to unfold in its own time, as it has for 5,000 years, as it will for however long human beings continue to wonder about who we are and where we came from, and why we remain when so much else has passed away into the long silence of history. And so, we arrive at the end of our journey together, a journey that began in the dust of ancient Nineveh, where clay tablets lay silent for millennia, waiting for hands to unearth them and minds to decipher their wedge-shaped secrets. And from that dust, we traveled backward through time to the very beginning of recorded memory, to the great cities that rose between the two rivers, to the ziggurats that climbed toward heaven, to the temples where priests fed gods they could not see but believed they could feel. And in those sacred spaces we encountered the Anunnaki, the great ones who descended from the sky, who held council in celestial courts and debated the fate of the creatures they had fashioned from clay and divine blood. And we learned of the 5 bloodlines, each one a different experiment in creation, each one carrying different gifts and different flaws. The workers who toiled without question, the servants who questioned too much, the priest-kings who reached for divine status, the giants who consumed more than the earth could provide, and finally the 5th bloodline, created in secret by Enki the Wise One, hidden among the others like a seed buried against winter, carrying within them the qualities that would allow survival when the waters rose to wash the world clean. And we stood beside Enki as he spoke to the reed wall, finding a way to save what he loved without breaking his oath. And we felt the terror of the deluge and the silence that followed. And we watched the ark come to rest upon the mountain, and the first sacrifice rise as sweet smoke toward hungry gods who had learned perhaps too late the cost of destruction. And now, here we are, you and I, separated by however many years or miles or circumstances divide us, yet connected by this story that has passed from mouth to ear, from stylus to clay, from ancient scribe to modern voice, for 5,000 years and more. And whether you believe these events happened as the tablets describe, or whether you hold them as beautiful myths that encode deeper truths about human nature and divine mystery, the story has value either way, teaching us as it taught our ancestors about the dangers of pride and the necessity of humility, about the importance of listening even when the message comes through walls or whispers or dreams, about the capacity to adapt when the world changes around us, about the stubborn persistence of hope even when the waters rise. And there is a strange comfort, is there not, in knowing that others have lain awake wondering these same things, that the questions you carry were carried before you by countless others stretching back to the very dawn of wondering. And we must acknowledge as we prepare to part that the full truth remains hidden. The tablets are broken, the translations debated, whole chapters of the story lost to time and fire and the slow, patient work of decay. And perhaps this is as it should be. Perhaps some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but only to be carried, held gently in the mind like water cupped in hands, precious precisely because it cannot be grasped too tightly. And so as sleep approaches and the world grows quiet around you, may you rest well in the knowledge that you are part of something ancient and ongoing. May the old stories visit you in dreams that feel like memories. May you wake in the morning still wondering still curious, still carrying that spark of the divine that the tablets say was mixed into the very clay from which the first humans were shaped. And know that even now as you listen, the Tigris and Euphrates continue their slow, eternal journey to the sea. And the great tells of Mesopotamia still hold their secrets beneath layers of dust and time. And the same stars that shone over Sumer shine now through your window or above your roof. The same ancient light falling on new eyes, and somewhere in your blood, in the very cells that carry you through each day, there echoes still the memory of survival, the gift of the fifth bloodline, the quiet, stubborn insistence on continuing that brought your ancestors through flood and famine and countless forgotten struggles to arrive at last at you. Breathing softly now, eyelids growing heavy, drifting gently towards sleep as the story settles into silence, and the night enfolds you in its ancient and star-scattered peace.